Hello and welcome to Ghost History Medium. This is the investigation number 5 reveal of the Silk Mill, Boonton, New Jersey. This location was so cool and it's such a prominent building and it's easily seen from the highway. Although we weren't able to go inside the building, we were able to walk around the perimeter, and trust me, that was plenty to get enough information about this location. So let's get going. Let's orient ourselves to where we were doing the investigation. On the right is a large map of New Jersey, and as you can see, we were just north and just west of New York City. And then just a little bit closer in the map here, you can see the highway, which is 287, the street we were on. And the map on the top is the satellite view. And I'm going to use it because it's showing the direction that we were facing for at least the beginning and the majority of our reading. And this is going to be important later when we start talking about the Boonton Reservoir and where those individuals were coming up from. The individual that came to us and gave us the most information about this building, I'm going to call him the first mill owner or the first mill builder. And we're going to hear a lot of clips from him right now, and it's going to launch us into further discussion about the Boonton Silk Mill and Pelgram Meyer.
Builder and owner.
One and the same. The first owner.
Yeah.
Yeah, the first owner.
Still here.
Started this place. Well, a lot of times when it's like your own child, your own creation, your energetic imprint will be prominent in a place like this. He was a fairly wealthy individual, but he was a self-made wealthy individual. So he was not one that he came from riches. He was kind of a self-made individual. I also get that he was younger when he first built this place, and he got a lot of flack from it. Like, people like laughed at him, like, you'll never succeed, you'll never do this, you'll never win, you'll never be successful. But he was successful in the business that went on in here.
How old was he when he started it?
I want to say he was like in his 30s or 40s, but he was pretty young. I'm seeing him in a gray suit. It's specifically gray, and I'm actually specifically seeing him with a long, pointy, almost like a Frenchman-like beard.
Really?
Yeah.
What year? Era?
Late 1800s, like 1890. 1890 was when this it's a mill, and it used the water from the rivers. Well, he's walking with us. He actually kind of likes this. He's like, yes, tell my story, tell it all. Okay.
Are you getting a name?
For the gentleman? Or Ralph Packard. It's an R name. It's an R name.
Okay. You want to keep walking?
He died from a heart attack. I got 50s. I do like his energy though. Like, as I've been speaking to him, I'm like smiling. So this gentleman, who was the owner and builder of this place, the original, he's saying that he worked in the top office right underneath the clock, and he like took great pride in that it faced the town, and like he could look out over the town, and he liked that. But he did well. From the ground up, kind of done well. I'm getting women and men were here. So it wasn't just like workers. So it wasn't just only men, it wasn't only women, there were both. So I don't know if there were different departments, but it wasn't just like the mills in Massachusetts that I'm very familiar with, where it was just like women workers working all day long, like 20 hours a day. I'm also getting the sense that they weren't poorly treated because they were locals, and he felt like a local. So he was strict, but he treated them fairly well, to be honest. There were injuries here. Workers definitely, I don't know why I can't I'm getting coughing, like inhalation issues, ventilation issues, coughing, coughing. Workers would cough. I did start to feel like there were some children who worked here. It was a busy place. This was a busy place.
Yeah.
Busy place. But it does seem like most workers were like pretty satisfied with their work here. Didn't feel like an abusive situation. It didn't feel like slave work, slave labor. It felt like it came from the community, and like the community had an opportunity to work in this building.
So during my research to try and find who this individual was who came to speak to us about this building, I actually found out that this building was not the original site of the silk mill in Boonton, but in fact, the original Boonton Silk Mill, which was started in 1875, was further up the hill in Boonton, and it was between Mechanic, Cedar, and Division Street. Now, why this was the original site and why this originally was started in the town was because there was a huge community upset. Originally, there was an iron mill, and around this time, the iron mill was the main supplier and main economic driver of the community, but it was failing. So the community banded together and they said, hey, we need to create a new industry in our town if we're going to still be economically viable. So a group got together and they actually created the Boonton Silk Mill. And after 2 years, unfortunately, the enterprise failed, and it was blamed on the manager, who was James Stansfield, and it was said that he didn't have enough capital and he just ran it to the ground. But unfortunately, after 2 years, the endeavor failed, but it will lead us into who purchased it after. This is a directory of silk manufacturers in the United States from 1876, and here is listed the Boonton Silk Factory. J.A. Van Orden was the president, S.L. Garrison was the secretary, James Stansfield was the manager, and they did piece goods located in Boonton. So the individual on the left here in the black hat is John I. Copp. And he, at this time the picture was taken, was the mayor of Boonton. Now, I did find resources that said that John I. Copp also put in a lot of money into this enterprise because, again, they said James Stansfield didn't have capital and it kept failing. So he was highly involved as a community individual. And this gentleman in the middle, although this is not James Stansfield, but this is James Stansfield's son, E.A. Stansfield. Now, E.A. Stansfield gets to grace the history books because, unlike his father, he was a very successful silk manager, but in Pennsylvania. And I just did find it interesting that this man, his beard is extremely pointy and it's very unique. Again, I couldn't find a picture. James Stansfield, it's possible that his father also had a pointy long beard, but I don't know. And this gentleman on the right is named S.L. Garrison. Now, he was the secretary of the Boonton Silk Factory, but he also was a very prominent individual in the Boonton town. He ran the Boonton Bulletin for 50 years, which was a local newspaper. He was in the state legislature, and he was well known in the community and in New Jersey. So when this first enterprise was starting to fail, S.L. Garrison went to Paterson, New Jersey to lobby for some other silk business investors to come in and take over the company. Now, why did he go to Paterson, New Jersey? Well, apparently during this time, Paterson, New Jersey was the spot for silk business manufacture. It was the epicenter on the East Coast for silk manufacturing. Who knew? I didn't know until I started doing this research, but it's a huge part of Paterson's history. And a lot of those buildings that are present in Paterson today are built because they were originally used for silk. Anyway, so he went and he lobbied this new company that was just starting. And that company just happened to be Pelgram and Meyer. Now, they purchased the Boonton Silk Factory in 1880, and they ran it out of the original site up on Mechanic Street for about a year. It ended up employing about mostly children, and it turned out that they were not very happy and they were not treating them very well there. But they were so successful in that 1 year that Pelgram and Meyer decided to then go ahead and build this massive 1,000 foot by 50 foot, 4-story tall Mill Building at the site where we did our location, and it was built in 1881. It also turns out that Mr. Pelgram was the one who was mostly in charge of the buildings, and Mr. Meyer was mostly in charge of the sales of their products in New York City. This here on the right is an insurance map from 1886, and it shows that on each level they did have different facets of silk manufacturing going on: spinning, weaving, and storage. So it was kind of in hindsight a blessing in disguise that the original enterprise failed, because then it allowed this company to come in and build this huge building. It ended up employing about 500 Bootonians, and at the height of their business, they employed 2,500 individuals. Only 500 were in Boonton, the rest were in Paterson, but again, it was a huge enterprise. And in 1882, it was estimated that their finished annual product amounted to nearly $2 million, which would be $38 million today, which is enormous. And they were among the very top silk manufacturers in the country. Now, this is one of my favorite photographs of this research. This is an actual picture inside the silk building of women and children working and spinning. And remember how I compared it to the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts? Well, I'm not seeing women stuffed in like sardines. There's lots of windows. It looks like there's ventilation. But this is proof that there were definitely children and women working in this building. Now, multiple times I talked about coughing, and respiratory issues. Well, I was able to find in the 6th National Congress on Tuberculosis from 1908, specifically about the mortality of silk mill workers. And just about half of silk mill workers died from respiratory disease. Now, at this time, 38% of the causes were from consumption, which was tuberculosis, which one of the major symptoms is coughing, but the other 11% died from bronchitis, asthma, pneumonia, and emphysema. So who were these individuals that ran such a successful business? Well, one of them was Charles Raoul Pelgram, and he died in 1887 at 43 years of age. He came from Germany as an immigrant, and he started working in Paterson and from the bottom up. Mr. Pelgram partnered with Mr. Meyer in 1872. Mr. Pelgram was only 28 years old when they first started together. They started with 20 looms in a rented floor in a mill in Paterson, New Jersey, and together they became so successful. Now, Mr. Pelgram was only 37 years old when that mill building was built in Boonton, and those ages go right along with what I was talking about, speaking with a young guy. This picture on the left is a house that Mr. Pelgram built in Paterson, New Jersey, although I wouldn't really call it a house. It looks definitely more like a mansion. And his picture is on the right, and he gets to be in history books because, again, he was a very successful, well-known silk businessman. And it looks like he's wearing a three-piece gray suit there. Okay, remember how I also said this individual who did have a beard but also looked like Ulysses S. Grant? I didn't even really know what Ulysses S. Grant looked like at the top of my head, and I don't really know why that name came to me, but I was able to find some comparisons of the two. Now, there's a lot of data about Ulysses S. Grant because he's a president, but I was able to find Charles R. Pelgram's passport, U.S. passport from 1884, which describes all of his features. Turns out both men were about the same height. They both had dark gray eyes or gray eyes, although some references for Ulysses S. Grant said he had blue eyes. They both had brown hair, small mouths, round chins, like complexion, and round faces. And, you know, looking at these two pictures side by side, they do kind of look similar, and they're at least from the same generation. This is an image of Mr. Pelgram's gravesite, and it is around Paterson, New Jersey. And this on the right is an excerpt from his obituary, and it mostly what I wanted to take from this was just how strong his character was and how loved he was. In it, it specifically describes that he was the soul of honest and energy and lie wherever ready to recognize merit wherever he found it. Socially, he was pleasant and genial in disposition, and his death caused pangs of regret in men's hearts. That's pretty strong. I mean, he did die really young, and he was really at the height of his company's success. He didn't even really get to enjoy his mansion very long. but this was his life project. And I really got that sense from this gentleman who spoke to me, who I do firmly believe was Mr. Pelgram. The R name Raoul for his middle name, the ages were correct, and just kind of his general demeanor. I really liked this guy, and he definitely had a lot of pride in this building that he had his first hand in building. The other man who was a part of the partnership was Esaias Mayer, and he died just 1 year after Mr. Pelgram, but he was 75 years old. He also was a self-made man. He also emigrated from Germany, and he also died from a heart attack. But I don't believe this was a gentleman I was speaking to because the ages were not correct. And Mr. Meyer lived in New York City and did more of the sales part of it, whereas Mr. Pelgram did more of the actual mill and management of the mills. I did find this interesting that this excerpt comes from an article that says that both gentlemen were afflicted with a heart ailment, probably brought about by the continual use of the long stairs in the new factory. Now, I couldn't find any references that they built any other factory other than the Boonton factory. And remember how I was talking about that their office was right at the top of the building underneath the clock? Again, I don't know, it's not how people die from heart attacks, but I thought it was an interesting reference that kind of coincided with me saying that he would go all the way to the top of the stairs to run his business. After the death of both of the original founders of Pelgram and Meyer, their company continued on and it continued to be successful. It ran its business out of that mill building that we did the investigation at until 1927 when it was sold. Okay, that kind of wraps up the first mill owner builder that we talked to at the site, and that brings us to 1927. So let's see what happened from that time frame on, and we'll talk about the Cantor Auto Products starting in 1977 to today.
When did you sell this place? It stopped in the 30s, and it was abandoned for 20 years, and then it was sold and renovated in the 60s. What was it into? He said it became a junkyard?
This is a junkyard?
He said it became a junkyard. Dogs, like even guard dogs. Like I think he had guard dogs. Like it was like kind of like
owner?
Yeah, it was like a kind of classic, something to do with cars. Remodeling cars, but it wasn't in the building. I don't know. The original owner has a lot of pride, and he's excited and really happy that they've decided, because it was a little up in the air. He said a little up in the air if they were going to destroy this building or not when this current owner bought it. It was up in the air, but it seemed like I think the town wanted it to be retained, and they figured out a way that it would be more economical to renovate this place and not just knock it down.
Finding out what happened to this building after the Pelgram and Meyer had sold it in 1927 was really difficult. I couldn't find much in the way of history between 1927 to 1938. There was one reference of a doll factory being in there, but I was able to find that in 1938, the Beverly Bag Company took over the building and they made handbags. I couldn't find out when it closed, but I did find a reference that someone worked there at around 1953. So at least until 1953, the Beverly Bag Company was functioning out of that building. Now, between 1953 and 1976, I have no clue. It could have been renovated. It could have been abandoned. It could have been abandoned before the Beverly Bag Company. I don't know. This is information that I'm going to continue to look into, and once the quarantine and COVID's over, I'm hoping to go back and try and find more information. But in 1977, Cantor Auto Products bought the building, and what they do is they're two brothers and they sell antique car parts. So the entire building was stuffed with car parts from bottom to top. Now, that goes along with, I guess, somebody thinking it was a junkyard. This here is an image of one of their shelves on their floors. I did find images of less pretty organization, but there were a lot of car parts. And I guess one could consider them junk if they are not into building antique cars. Their company was founded in 1960, but they didn't buy this building until 1977. They sold the building in 2017, and they had so many products in there that it took them almost over a year to get all their products out. This is the current proposed plan for the building. It's supposed to be apartment buildings, and it's going to be completed in the next few years. So that wraps up the information about the building, and we're going to go into some information about the individuals that were around the perimeter, which is going to take us to Greenwood Cemetery, Boonton Reservoir, and the Boonton Alms House.
After I just opened up to this location, I started getting many individuals coming up from this area, from this direction. That's by the reservoir. Many individuals, curious, they're just walking up from the reservoir. Natives, so like some Native Americans, but mostly white men and women, children, family members, walking up from the reservoir. This is really interesting. And the other thing that's still happening as we're walking around is there are still those individuals. There's a row of nondescript individuals that came up over the hill from the reservoir. Sad individuals. They're all sad individuals. Later than colonial, but earlier than the late 1800s. So maybe like 1850-ish time, 1850 to 1930.
So in general, when I have a group of individuals that come up from the same location, when they come up together, they seem to have similar time frame about them. I generally think of a burial ground or cemetery. Now, there were Native Americans in this group, and I couldn't find any information specifically about Native Americans around the Boonton Reservoir, but I know that there were Lenape Native Americans who lived in the area. Now, as far as cemetery goes, there is a cemetery that is in that exact direction, called Greenwood Cemetery, and it was established in 1872. So around the time frame that I was talking about, which was about 1850 to 1830. Now, this cemetery is actually still being in use, and you can go there today. It's a beautiful old cemetery with lovely old trees there. So that's one possibility, is that these individuals were just coming up from Greenwood Cemetery. So one of the other really interesting historical facts I found was that Boonton actually wasn't originally up here on the hill. So Boonton was actually down by the valley where the current reservoir is. It was called Old Boonton, and it was down there until about 1830 when the canal was completed. And then most of the residents moved from the valley there up into the hill. Now, it wasn't until 1899 when a contract was signed that this was going to be the site of a reservoir being made for Jersey City. Now, why would they decide that this spot was good? Well, there was only a few buildings left after they all moved up the hill, and some of the buildings were farms. There was an orphanage and the Morris County poorhouse. Prior to the flooding of the area, all houses and buildings were removed by either being demolished or taken apart and reassembled elsewhere. These two pictures were taken during severe droughts, and you can see once the water level is really low, there are stone walls left over, latrines, and foundations. The picture on the left, where the star is where we did our location investigation. From multiple sources, I read that the location of the poorhouse, which housed anywhere between 100 to 150 individuals, families, and children at any time, was actually located where the island is now seen in the middle of the reservoir. These individuals who lived here were orphans, mentally unwell, or cripples from the surrounding area. And there are poorhouse census information from 1860, 1870, 1880, and 1890. Using that census data, I tried to find if any of the individuals who were in the poorhouse were buried in Greenwood Cemetery because it would have been so close by at the time. And I couldn't find anything that lined up that those individuals were buried in Greenwood Cemetery. So then I got to thinking, well, where are these individuals buried who lived in the poorhouse? And apparently I'm not the only one who was wondering this. So this is a reference from one of the books by Arlene Fowler Dempsey, The Old Boonton and the Jersey City Reservoir. This is an article from 1899, the same year that the contract was signed that the reservoir was going to be built there. It's titled, A Grave Problem. What is to be done with the 200 bodies at the county farm? And it goes on to speak that there's a cemetery there at the old almshouse property, which again would have been at the top of the hill. And what is going to happen with them when the reservoir is flooded? I couldn't find any information after this, if they did decide to rebury them or if they just left them. What information I could find that was prior to the flooding, the adult home was moved to a different location in Morris County, and the orphanage, which was then known as Eliathus Hall, was moved to the other side of the reservoir in Parsippany. Now, the orphanage was operating from 1881 to 1929. Again, right around those years that I was talking about. And it housed about 20 children at one time, aged 3 to 16, whose parents lived in the Boonton Almshouse. And that takes me to the Little Lost Cemetery, which lies behind the Parsippany Firehouse just next to Highway 287 North. For a reference of where we were doing our investigation, which is the yellow star on the right, to where the Little Lost Cemetery is the yellow star on the left, and this is around Boonton Reservoir. This small, well-cared-for cemetery has 14 gravestones, but it's believed that there are additional unmarked graves at this site. There's even one stone that it's unmarked, and it's called the Unknown Angel. I do feel that the individuals who came around the perimeter during the reading did come from a burial ground. I do feel that they were from the almshouse, as they seemed really sad and depressed, which is not typical representation of a normal cemetery population I've encountered before, and the ages of the years was appropriate to come up with families and children from 1850 to 1930s, which was around the same exact time that the almshouse was there and the orphanage. I will tell you, we did go to visit this location, and it definitely has some vibes. It's public, so you can go and you can pay your respects as well and honor some forgotten local history. Thank you to the local Boonton Historical Society for help in obtaining some of this information during the COVID quarantine, and let me know if you have any additional history to add or any comments.